Mr. President, it was December the 7th, 1941. A young African-American man from the south side of Chicago was celebrating his 23rd birthday. He was in a neighborhood tavern and somebody bolted through the front door and cried out that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. In 1943, that same young man was inducted into the United States Army, a segregated institution at the time. He landed in Normandy within days of D-Day. He fought across France in the Battle of the Bulge. While his unit regrouped, they heard rumors, horrible rumors, about a camp near Weimar, Germany. This young soldier and his commanding officer hopped into a jeep to see for themselves. What he witnessed at Buchenwald, the Nazi death camp, changed this man forever. He recalled in his memoirs, his first thought was, quote, "This is what happened to my ancestors. This is what happens when human beings see others less than human." And then he made a vow to himself. He said, and I quote, "I made an emotional decision that when I returned from the Army, the rest of my life would be spent trying to make the place where I live and the bigger world a place where all people could have peace and justice." That soldier's name was Timuel Black. He kept that vow faithfully for 76 years. Tim Black was a foot soldier for justice. He died last week at the age of 102, living in the neighborhood that had been his home nearly all his life, a place that he personally called a sacred ground, the south side of Chicago. His passing is our loss, our city, our state, and our nation. If you're not from Chicago, you may not know his name, but we all live in an America that is better because Timuel Black helped shape it. He was a living link to some of our nation's worst sins and our greatest achievements. All four of Tim Black's grandparents were born into slavery. When he was 1 year old, Tim Black and his parents left Alabama and the terrorism of Jim Crow and headed to Chicago, part of the first wave of America's Great Migration. They settled on the south side in a then segregated neighborhood known as Bronzeville. After he served in World War II, Tim Black returned to Chicago. He graduated from Roosevelt University, earned a master's degree in history from the University of Chicago. Taught history in Chicago public schools in 1955 when he heard a young minister speaking on television. He was so moved that he decided, at his own expense, to fly to Montgomery, Alabama to meet this man, a man by the name of Martin Luther King, Jr. In 1963, Dr. King and the great African-American labor leader, A. Philip Randolph, called on Tim Black. They asked him to organize Chicago's contingent to come to Washington for the Great March on Washington. Three years later, Tim Black asked them to return the favor, and he persuaded Dr. King to bring his campaign for racial justice to Chicago. Together, they pressed for an end to discriminatory housing laws that squeezed many of the city's black residents into overpriced ramshackle apartments in unsafe, segregated neighborhoods with few jobs and failing schools. In 1975, after decades working at high schools, Tim Black became a professor of sociology, anthropology, and black history in what is now known as Harold Washington College. He was the griot of Chicago, who preserved the rich history of the Great Migration in Bronzeville. He was also a brilliant political strategist who understood how to use his power to help others. So in 1982, Harold Washington, who had been his friend since they were children, was representing their neighborhood in the U.S. House of Representatives. Professor Black and a few others went to Harold Washington and said, "You have to run for mayor of Chicago." Washington replied, "Sure, if you get 50,000 new black voters and raise $100,000, I'll consider it." Washington figured that was the end of it. They'd never reach those goals. But Professor Tim Black started a fundraising drive and helped organize a voter registration campaign that ultimately registered not 100,000, not 50,000, but 263,000 new voters in Chicago. And he raised more than $1 million for the Harold Washington campaign. In 1983, with the support from voters from all backgrounds, black, white, and brown, Harold Washington became Chicago's first black mayor. A decade later, a young lawyer by the name of Barack Obama sought out Professor Tim Black's guidance when he first considered running for office. Last month, President Obama returned to the South Side to break ground on the Obama Presidential Center in Jackson Park. Although Professor Black's failing health didn't allow him to attend in person, it's a good bet that ceremony couldn't have happened without him. Mr. President, I was blessed to know Tim Black. When Barack Obama, my Senate colleague from Illinois, was elected president, I was given a handful of tickets to the inauguration. The first name that came to my mind was Tim Black. He had to be there. And his wife, Zenobia Johnson Black, a personal friend who volunteered to drive me in my first Senate campaign. Zenobia is a wonderful person. She's an exciting driver, and we had many escapades together. So I invited Tim and Zenobia to come and sit in the best seats that I had for the inaugural of Barack Obama, the first African-American president from the South Side of Chicago. I was fortunate. I knew Tim Black. I counted him as a friend. I was there sitting next to him at his 100th birthday party. It was a great night, and the man still had it all together and a great sense of humor. Loretta and I send our condolences to his beloved wife of 40 years, Zenobia Johnson Black, his daughter, Ermetra, and countless friends and students. A great man has left us. He will be missed. Mr. President, I ask at a separate place in the record that the following comments be placed.
Without objection.
Tomorrow, the Senate's going to vote on whether to protect free and fair elections in America. And the big question we have to ask in the United States Senate is whether the right to vote and free and fair elections are worth any of our time. You see, the first vote we have here is on what's known as a motion to proceed. It's a basic question to the Senate. You want to talk about something? Is it important enough for your time? You want to bring it up here and say a few words about the right to vote in America? That's the first vote. I think it's pretty simple. Why wouldn't we, at this moment in history, with everything that's going on, spend some time talking about the right to vote? Senator McConnell, the Republican leader, says no. We shouldn't take any time to discuss the right to vote in the United States of America. He and many of our Republican colleagues are threatening to use the age-old weapon against civil rights, the filibuster, to stop even a conversation on the floor of the United States Senate about the right to vote. That would make the third time this year that Senate Republicans have used the filibuster to kill voting rights legislation. They filibustered the For the People Act twice this year after it passed the House. They said then that they support voting rights, but not that voting rights bill. They said more compromise was needed. Well, you can't reach compromise on anything until you talk about it. And we're going to have a motion to proceed to talk about voting rights on the floor of the Senate tomorrow. So if they want to offer a compromise, if they want to get into a conversation or a debate, that's the moment. This empty chamber, I wonder sometimes why we leave it the way it is. This would be a great meeting hall. We could rent it out for wedding receptions and have something productive happen on the floor of the United States Senate. But instead, this empty chamber, day after day, finds ways to avoid the important issues of our time. That's sad. There are very few of us who've been given this great honor and opportunity to serve in the Senate. We're supposed to come and talk about the things that matter in America. Isn't the right to vote one of the most important things that matters in this country? The Freedom to Vote Act is a compromise itself. It's based on a set of principles offered by Senator Manchin of West Virginia. Now, Senator Manchin's not concealed the fact that he didn't agree with the original bill, but in fairness to him, he sat down in good faith and bargained a compromise bill. He's worked exhaustively for months with Democrats, Republicans, and independents to find some common ground. I salute him for that. That's what we all should be doing. The Freedom to Vote Act includes reasonable national standards for a voter ID. Now, that's a big concession from the Democratic side because although many of our states have a voter ID, many do not. And we believe in some cases in the past it's been abused. But the fundamental concept of a voter ID, I don't have any objection to, as long as it's managed and administered fairly, and that's what we're setting out to do. So if our Republican colleagues are really worried about election integrity and making sure voters are who they say they are, wouldn't you think that they would at least vote to start the debate on the Freedom to Vote Act? That we would have a conversation in this empty chamber that might even attract a handful of senators on both sides of the aisle to talk about the right to vote in America in the year 2021 and beyond. That just seems so basic. Well, what the Republicans say is the Freedom to Vote Act is much more than just a debate topic. It is a federal takeover of our elections. That simply is not the case. The Freedom to Vote Act does not create any undue burden on any state. Instead, it sets reasonable minimum standards for voting access in all states, including automatic and same-day voter registration, 2 weeks of early voting, no excuse mail-in voting. It establishes Election Day as a federal holiday. All of these proposals are consistent with the clear language of the Constitution. It will protect nonpartisan election officials from undue pressure and prevent politicians from overturning elections if they don't like the voters' choices. The Freedom to Vote Act also makes it harder for billionaires and powerful corporations to buy elections. Let's be real honest. Members of Congress and others run for office, set out to raise money. But the important fundraising is taking place in a mystery, in a secret, with black money and dark money that comes into an election with no indication of its source. It's going to prevent the flow of foreign money into U.S. elections. Is there anybody who wants to argue for the premise that we should allow foreigners to invest in our election results or to try to influence the electorate, sometimes with misinformation and outright lies? I don't think they have any business interfering in our election. I think most Americans agree with it. That's what the Freedom to Vote Act says. In addition to that, dark money needs to get out of politics. If you want to stand up and support a candidate, so be it. But for goodness sakes, say who you are. Identify yourself. Let the American people know who's pushing one candidate or the other. Organizations engaged in political spending will be required to tell the public who's giving them how much money. That's pretty simple, pretty obvious. There was a time when that level of disclosure was supported by the Republican minority leader in the Senate. I remember his speeches well on the floor of the Senate. He shifted 180 degrees on the topic now. Last fall, 2020, Americans braved a pandemic to vote in record numbers. Exhaustive legal challenges and recounts seeking to validate the outrageous lie of election fraud went nowhere. Former President Trump went to 50 or 60 different courts to argue that Joe Biden didn't win the election. He couldn't produce a shred of evidence. All he had were the ramblings and gossip and fake news, if you will, on the internet. It didn't work. Rudy Giuliani came up with some harebrained schemes on behalf of President Trump. Italy-gate, that somehow the Italians had satellites that controlled America's voting machinery. Ridiculous things. When that didn't work, the former president decided he would just take over the Department of Justice. Our committee, Judiciary Committee, which we serve on, Mr. President, went into extensive investigation of that and came up with detailed information which we released to the public 2 weeks ago. And the Republicans were in on all of our investigation. They were invited to question the witnesses, to be present, to even see our majority report in advance. We wanted to make this bipartisan and fair, and we did. And what they came up with was the president's failed attempt to take over the Department of Justice, to force them to go to the states and say, don't validate the 2020 election. A few people stood up and showed courage in the Department of Justice and said they were prepared to resign before they bent to the President Trump's pressure. And that was a fact. That's what we face with now. This former president still marketing his lies across America about the outcome of the 2020 election. And we will not even take the time to discuss elections and voting. The Republicans will stop us with a filibuster. Many politicians in many states continue to use the big lie of a stolen election to try to make it harder for citizens to vote in future elections. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, 19 states have passed 33 bills this year, making it harder for citizens to vote. Hundreds of similar bills have been proposed in 49 states. These proposals and laws are a dagger at the heart of democracy. The Freedom to Vote Act, which we want to start the conversation on, just the conversation and debate on tomorrow, is America's Democracy Defense Act. I want to commend the bill's sponsors. Senator Amy Klobuchar, I don't know anybody who's worked harder than she has as chair of the Senate Rules Committee. Joe Manchin, he's been involved in compromise and negotiation. I salute him for it. Tim Kaine, Angus King, Jeff Merkley, the presiding officer, Alex Padilla, John Tester, and Reverend Raphael Warnock all have played a critical role in bringing us to where we are. And particularly I want to acknowledge our majority leader, Chuck Schumer, for his leadership in this effort. He has really worked hard at it, trying to bring this matter before the American people on the floor. We've also been engaged in a similar process on an equally critical piece of legislation, John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Mr. President, I've been here long enough to remember a time when the Voting Rights Act came before the United States Senate and got 98 votes. Virtually all the Democrats, all the Republicans voted for it. No controversy. They believed that this product of the 1960s civil rights debate was fair. It said that in certain states with a proven history of discrimination against minority voters, when they proposed changes in election laws, we would examine them, pre-clear them, as they say. The Supreme Court tossed out that section, and we have tried to restore it. I think the Supreme Court was wrong, and maybe even naive in believing that voter discrimination could not take place in the future. For example, when there was a contest over district maps in the state of North Carolina, and it was taken to a federal court, the federal judge said, and I paraphrase, they worked with surgical precision to discriminate against African American voters in these maps. That's the kind of conduct which can't be tolerated in any state, red or blue. The Freedom to Vote Act is the first of two crucial steps we're going to take to protect what our late friend and colleague John Lewis called a, quote, precious, almost sacred right. And I hope that we also take similar action on the Voting Rights Act next week. Like both of these bills, the Voting Rights Act extension that Ronald Reagan signed in 1982 was a result of a compromise. The final bill, when President Reagan signed it and said, prove that differences can be settled in goodwill and good faith, wouldn't it be refreshing to have that happen again on the floor of this, the empty floor of this Senate tomorrow? That's all we're asking of our Republican colleagues. Don't use the filibuster, the weapon of Jim Crow, to abet the assault on voting rights. Offer amendments if you like, but work with us in goodwill and good faith to protect the voting rights which so many have sacrificed for.